This video is brought to you by Incogni. While many of us think that Brexit is a thing that's done and dusted, it seems that Keir Starmer and his Labour Party are keen to continue working on it, if, as the polls suggest, they win the next general election. About this, there's been a significant amount of press speculation about exactly how Starmer will change the UK's relationship with the EU. Some have suggested that he could try and rejoin or recreate key EU institutions, such as the single market or customs union. Others have suggested that he'll be more restrained and simply build on the existing UK-EU trade deal. So in this video, we're going to look into this, evaluating exactly what the Labour Party want to do in relation to Europe and whether they're likely to achieve this. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. Now, it's worth starting this video by having a quick look at the policy of the Labour Party towards Brexit in the last few years. In the 2019 election, which was dominated by Brexit, the Labour Party advocated for a renegotiation of the terms of the withdrawal agreement, which had only just been negotiated by then Prime Minister Boris Johnson, followed by a subsequent referendum. This was something that the then Shadow Brexit Secretary, Sir Keir Starmer, agreed with, stating that the second referendum plan was a very important commitment, and it's one that we will keep. In fact, Starmer went even further, suggesting that he'd campaign for Remain in the event of a second referendum. The public rejected this plan though, with Labour suffering their worst defeat in a general election since 1935. Following this, Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn resigned, and Starmer became leader of the party. It appears, though, that as leader, Starmer's approach to EU relations has changed significantly. In the last year, he's been keen to try and show voters that he himself is committed to Brexit, and that a government led by him would certainly not aim to rejoin the European Union. He's explicitly said that there is no case for rejoining the European Union, and that under Labour, the UK would not be going back into the EU in any form. However, just because Labour have said that they won't take the UK back into the EU, it doesn't mean that they won't seek an ever closer relationship with the bloc. So let's move on and have a look at what Starmer's plan actually is to improve UK-EU relations. It's worth starting this by pointing out that while Starmer has some vague plans for improving relations, all of these are confined by his Brexit red lines. These are that Labour will not take the UK back into the single market, the customs union, or reintroduced free movement. As such, despite reports in the news last week that the EU had proposed a UK youth mobility scheme, which will allow 18 to 30-year-olds in the UK and EU to work and live in each other's countries, Labour actually rejected this outright. In a statement about the scheme, a Labour source pointed out that the mobility schemes are synonymous with freedom of movement, and that this would break one of their aforementioned red lines. Now, it is worth taking Labour's statement on this with a pinch of salt, though. In the run-up to the election, they're incredibly keen not to give the Tories anything to attack them on in relation to Brexit, so they may feel that they have to outright reject such a proposal. Whether they stand by this in office is another question entirely. So, publicly at least, Labour aren't all that keen on the youth mobility scheme. This raises the question, though, exactly what are they keen on? Well, at a meeting in Stansted Park in early March this year, it was suggested that the next Labour government will have a two-pronged approach towards the EU. The first will see Labour attempt a so-called Defence and Security Pact. This would mean that the UK would attend the EU's monthly Foreign Affairs Council, although Labour are reportedly not keen on attempting to secure voting rights. The logic is that this would help the UK have a more structured dialogue with the EU on foreign affairs, something that's important to both national security and the economy. The Shadow Foreign Secretary David Lammy has argued in favour of this idea, by stating that, given the difficult debates ahead with the US about defence burden sharing, it's ever more important that the UK develop closer foreign and security cooperation with the EU. Now, again, while Labour are keen to suggest that this plan is entirely about fostering dialogue with the EU on foreign affairs, insiders suggest that there could actually be more to it. Senior Labour officials have suggested that Starmer could deliberately widen the standard definition of such a pact, so that it covers areas such as migration, emissions trading schemes to tackle climate change, and joint agreements on critical raw material. Again though, this has not been discussed publicly, and whether Labour ever actually attempt to negotiate such a deal is not yet known. The second prong of their approach to the EU is to try and improve the UK-EU trade deal, potentially through a veterinary agreement. This would, in essence, build on the Northern Ireland Protocol and the Windsor Framework, and make it easier for agricultural products and food to be traded between the UK and EU. It seems that their plan is to use the review of the UK-EU trade deal, scheduled to take place in 2025 or 2026, to begin negotiations for this. Labour are hoping that, if they're successful, this would be enough to win over business, by making trade easier without going so far that it alienates Leave voters. At least this is the case if this is all that they're planning. Again, a Labour insider suggested that the party may want to enter into a de facto customs union with the EU, something that would certainly smooth trade but would definitely alienate Leave voters, and not to mention break one of their own red lines. Labour have denied that this is the case though. Irrespective of how far they do end up trying to go with improving the UK-EU trade deal, there just isn't any evidence that the EU will actually want to reopen negotiations. After all, they spent years painstakingly negotiating between their own member states and numerous Tory administrations to reach what they themselves called a very good agreement. All in all, right now, it just isn't all that clear what Labour are going to try and achieve in their negotiations with the EU, when and if they get into government. Perhaps they want a de facto customs union and a new youth mobility scheme, or perhaps they just want to reduce trade friction. We'll just have to see whether their new manifesto makes anything any clearer. While you've been watching this video, you might not realise that shady forces in the background are trying to collect your personal data from various sites, bundle it all together and then sell it to a third party. These data brokers can then sell your information to anyone, from a company to an online criminal. Now, you might assume that you're always safe online. Perhaps you regularly change your password, or even unsubscribe from annoying email newsletters that you never even remember signing up for. Unfortunately, this doesn't always save you. Companies that hold your data can still fall victim to a data breach, meaning that these data brokers can still compile all of your information and sell it on to others. The good news is you have the right to protect your privacy and request that the data brokers delete your personal information. But the bad news is that it would take you years to do it manually, and even then you need to repeat the process every few months as data brokers continue collecting your data. Luckily, this is where our sponsor Incogni comes in. Incogni reaches out to these data brokers on your behalf, requests that your data is removed, and then deals with any problems that might arise. Even more, Incogni is persistent and will put in multiple data removal requests after your data has been removed to make sure it doesn't go back on the market. So create an account with our link in the description, grant Incogni the ability to work on your behalf, and sit back as they make you safer. Plus, by using our link, you'll get an exclusive 60% off an annual Incogni plan. Thanks for checking it out, and thanks to Incogni for sponsoring this video.